On today's video, I continue digging through my garage for projects. This time, I found this small tulip table base. It's in good shape, but it needs a top. I also happen to have this pine board lying around and decided that I could use it to make a top for the base. The first step was to cut a circle out of the pine board. I used a jigsaw first just to cut out a rough circle, and then I cleaned it up with a router. And I'm using a circle cutting jig here, which I just made from some scrap MDF. And I just screwed the router into one end, and then drove a nail through the MDF and into the pine board at the appropriate distance, and it worked out pretty well. Next, I wanted to put a round over along the edge of the tabletop. And to do this, I just used a round over bit in the router. The bit has a bearing that rides along the edge of the wood, and then the rest of the bit cuts the round over. Once the routing was done, I sprayed some water on the surface to raise the grain so that I could then sand it off. The idea is that the wood will absorb the water, which will cause the grain to raise, and then you can come back with sandpaper and sand it down and get rid of that fuzzy raised grain for a smoother finish in the end. And I don't always do this when I'm refinishing a piece of wood, but on a brand new piece of wood like this that's never been finished, I feel like it's especially helpful. With the sanding done, then it was time to apply some shellac. I'm applying shellac first because pine can be tricky to stain. It tends to absorb stain unevenly and look blotchy and just kind of ugly. So the idea is that the shellac will partially seal the wood so that it won't absorb as much stain. And the shellac I'm using, it's called Seal Coat, and it's by Zinsser. It's a pretty thin shellac, but I thinned it even further by adding some denatured alcohol. So I think it's about half Seal Coat and then half denatured alcohol that I added. After the shellac dried, I gave it a light sanding with some 220 grit sandpaper, and then got ready to apply the stain. But before I applied the stain, I tested out a couple of colors on the back side of the tabletop. The one on the left is walnut, and the one on the right is called candlelight. The walnut tends to be more brown, and the candlelight, to my eye, has more red in it. And neither one of them on their own was what I was going for, but I felt like if I used both of them, then that would get me closer to the color I was looking for. The first stain that I applied was the walnut, and I just wiped it on with a foam brush. And the stain that I'm using is gel stain, so this will also help to give me a more even finish on the pine. Since it's thicker than a liquid stain, it won't be absorbed as much into the wood, and that will result in less blotchiness. Once that coat of stain was dry, I sprayed a coat of shellac over it to seal it in. And I did this because I'm going to be wiping on another coat of stain over the first coat, and I didn't want to risk pulling off any of the first coat of stain with the second one. It also adds just a little bit of extra color too, which is nice. Once the shellac was dry, then I could add the second layer of stain, which is the candlelight. And I'm adding the two stain colors in different layers instead of mixing them together and applying them both at once, because I feel like doing it this way adds a little bit more depth to the color. And I just applied this the same as the first. I wiped it on and then wiped it right off with the paper towel. Once that coat of stain dried, then I put on another coat of shellac to seal it in so that I could put a third coat of stain on. And this time I had to wipe on the shellac because I ran out of the spray shellac. I did the spray shellac the first time just to minimize any risk of wiping off any of the stain by wiping on the shellac, but I had let the stain dry overnight and it worked out fine. I didn't pull any of it off. Once that coat of shellac was dry, then I could apply the third coat of stain, which is the walnut again, the same color that I put on the first time. But this time I'm applying it a little differently. I put on an extra heavy coat, and then I let it sit for maybe a minute or two until it just started to set up a little bit. And then I took a clean foam brush, and you can also use a paintbrush for this, but I didn't have one. And then I just lightly ran the brush over the stain, just kind of smoothing out any streaks or marks from when I applied the stain and taking off some of the excess, but also leaving a bunch on there. And that darkened it up considerably. And once that stain was dry, then it was time to put on the top coat, which in this case is wipe-on satin oil-based polyurethane. And this oil polyurethane, even though it's clear, it will add another layer of color, just a little bit, kind of a slight amber tint. And I like that for projects like this. But if you didn't want additional color, you could apply a water-based polyurethane. But personally, I usually like the color that an oil-based finish adds. Once the second coat of polyurethane was dry, I very lightly sanded it with some 320 grit sandpaper just to get off any little bits of dust or things like that that got caught in the finish. And then I applied the final coat of polyurethane. Once the finish was dry, I drilled some holes for the screws and mounted the base to the top. The final step was to take some fine steel wool and some wax and apply the wax to the top with the steel wool And this will leave you with an extra smooth finish. And here it is, all finished. Thanks for watching.